I think it's probably fair to say that many of you would count yourselves as people of faith, right? And the whole thing about faith is it's all about stuff that you can't see. The essence of faith is that you can't see it. And this is what the writer to the Hebrews says. And actually, I'm going to call him the preacher today, because I think as well as Hebrews being a letter, it's also a sermon. This is something that's been preached. So I'm going to call him the preacher today. And one of the key kind of things that the preacher says about faith is this. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the certainty of things not seen. Because the thing is, if you can see it, you don't have to have faith in it, do you? Because you can see it. So that's the whole point of faith. It's about things that you can't see. And what is it that we can't see? Well, currently, we can't see. If you're a follower of Jesus, we cannot see our King. We don't see him physically. We do see him at work in many other ways. We see him visibly at work, but we can't actually see him right now. And he's this king over a kingdom that we see glimpses of, but we don't see the whole thing yet. And yet this kingdom, the preacher says, therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. This faith that we have about the things that we can't see, it cannot be shaken. This is absolutely certain. And there is coming a day when what we believe will be made sight. We'll see it completely. And it cannot be shaken. But the very nature of this kingdom, Jesus says, is a kingdom of mustard seed. And it's a kingdom of yeast. It's things that are small and imperceptible and not big and impressive. But one day, all of the kingdoms of this world will be the kingdom of our God. What starts off as mustard seed and yeast becomes the thing that takes over everything. And that's what faith causes us to see. But what happens when our faith eyes fall and we start to rely on what we can see? Because it can look like we're giving ourselves to something that is failing. Because we can't see it yet. And so what do we do when it feels like what we're giving ourselves to is failing? Well, we kind of seek visible, functional saviors, things that we can see and we place our trust in. And I guess that helps to explain why we're witnessing in large scale church selling out to demonstrably corrupt political leaders who have offered them a seat at the table of power. It helps to explain why church pursues kind of mega church ambition, where we want to compete with the world for glitz and influence and power, trying, as Mark Sterling says, to do Jesus' work in non-Jesus-like ways. Because we're not content anymore with the mustard seed, and we're not content with the yeast. But I think bringing it down to a personal level, more subtly for us as individuals, when things are not working out as we'd hoped, and our faith eyes begin to fall. So we start to place our faith in human leaders or revert to the safety of things that we've known before. And the Hebrews, who this sermon was given to, this letter was written to, were in danger of doing exactly that. They were in danger of returning to the kind of familiarity of their Jewish roots and dependence on kind of physical human leaders. And so this letter, this sermon so far has told them, God is speaking. God has spoken, and he continues to speak. He spoke through his prophets, but actually what the prophet said was pointing you forwards. That wasn't the end destination. He's spoken through angels. The angels are not the end destination. He's pointing forwards, and it's pointing forwards to one who speaks a better word, the true and better word that is Jesus. You want to know what God is saying? Listen to Jesus. He speaks a better word, so lean into him, draw near to him, hear what he's got to say. And actually, don't even kind of get obstructed by seeing the prophets and the angels. Look through them. They're lenses by which we're meant to see Jesus all the more clearly. And as Tim took us through last week, the importance then that actually if God has spoken through Jesus, don't drift from this. Anchor yourself to this. Trust him. Trust this one who is the great high priest who represents you to God and God to you. Have you been tempted? He can help. And so in light of all of that, then, we come to the start of chapter 3. Therefore, Now, if you're a maths nerd, then this is my little gift to you today. Those 3 little dots there mean therefore, okay? And so for those of you that are lazy, I've now given you a gift that actually you can just put 3 little dots when you want to write therefore. So, therefore, in light of all of this, in light of everything that's been said up to this point, because of all of this, holy fam, brothers and sisters, you who share in a heavenly calling, and so he's definitely writing to Christians here, consider Jesus. Now, when he says consider Jesus, he's not just saying, like in the way when you go to get a meal deal and you consider, am I going to get the chicken fillet or the small sushi as my snack here? This is not that kind of consideration. We're talking about fixing your thoughts on him. We're talking about fixing all of your hopes, your dreams, your ambitions, your desires. Fix everything on Jesus. Give him your full attention. Fix your eyes on Jesus. And what he's going to do for us is to add to the already kind of majestic description of Jesus that we had in chapter 1. Long ago, many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But now, in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he's appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. This majestic picture that we already have of Jesus, he's amping it up. And he's saying Jesus is the apostle and high priest of our confession. And that might not sound impressive, but actually it is. Apostle means a sent one. And this means that Jesus is showing us what God is like, who he is and what he's like. And as his apostle, he's demonstrating to us fully. You want to know what God is like? Look at Jesus. I'm going to keep saying that, by the way. You want to know what God is like? Look at Jesus. Because Jesus is the ultimate apostle. He is the sent one. And the fact that Jesus is the sent one. Think about the beauty of this. Somebody sent him. That's God the Father. God the Father is a sending God. God the Son is a going God. He's a God who sends. He's a God who goes. And he's a God who loves. And that's why he sends and that's why he goes. He's also our high priest. As Tim kind of took us through beautifully last week, if he's the high priest of our confession, then it means that he represents us perfectly to God, and he represents God perfectly to us to draw us back into the relationship that we were created for. And then he says, this apostle and high priest who was faithful to him who appointed him. The fact that Jesus is faithful, it means that he has never made a promise that he will not fulfill. Everything that he has said he will do, he is faithful. And do you see how in all of this is kind of built up this picture that we've already got of Jesus as being the true and greater, the better. And then it feels like we get this sort of sharp right turn. Just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Now, why is he wheeling out Moses at this point? Well, actually what he's doing is he's wheeling out the big gun. Imagine you are a first century Jewish believer. You've been steeped in the Jewish faith all of your life. That's what you were familiar with. And Moses is kind of like the big gun, isn't he, in the Jewish faith? He's the one to whom the law was given. Moses is the really significant one. And so if you've been in that faith all your life, and then you saw Jesus as being the fulfillment of that, and you gave your faith to Jesus, but now everything is beginning to fall apart. You're being persecuted for following Jesus. What's the temptation going to be? Go back to Moses. And so what the pastor, the preacher, is doing for us here is saying, do you know what? Let's have a little bit of a face-off. Not a face-off, that's a bit dramatic, isn't it? But, let's do a little bit of compare and contrast between Moses and Jesus. If you are tempted in any way to go back to Moses, let's just see why Jesus is better. Now, the thing is, they trusted Moses, and you can understand why. If you think about all-time tributes that were written to people in the Bible, I don't think I can pick out a tribute to another person in the Bible that's quite like this one. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. I mean, that is wild in itself, isn't it? None like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Moses is the big gun. If you're going to go back to relying on anybody, you're going to go back to Moses. He's a don. He's amazing. And so, this writer wants them to see that actually, as impressive as Moses is just another lens through which to see Jesus. Now, just to give like a few little snapshots here into Moses' life. If you want to know the whole kind of life story of Moses and how it intertwines with the people of God, then read through Exodus to Deuteronomy. Or you could have come and watched The Prince of Egypt yesterday afternoon. And I'm sure it was a bit interesting, wasn't it? You know, there were some very lively kids there. So maybe no, actually you shouldn't have come yesterday afternoon. A private home showing might be better. But Moses is this towering character. He's this super impressive character. And, you know, for those of you that don't have like a kind of a handle on the life of Moses, we're just going to spend a few minutes whipping through Moses' kind of family album here, okay? So Moses starts off being born, which is where most of us start off, except Moses is born at a time when his people are in slavery in Egypt. His Hebrew people are in slavery, and they're all under threat. And there's a threat of a genocide, and there's a threat to kill all the babies. But Moses survives. Irony of ironies, Moses then ends up in the palace of the king, being brought up by the Egyptian pharaoh's family kind of household. And so there's this Hebrew slave being brought up as, and I quote, the Prince of Egypt. And so there you go, there's another plug for the film. Maybe I should ask for some, like, you know, royalties for the number of times I've plugged that film this morning. But anyway, he grows up as the Prince of Egypt, and yet he knows that he's a Hebrew. And so when he sees the Hebrews suffering, he pushes back against that, and he kills an Egyptian, and he ends up being sent into exile, and he's in the wilderness for 40 years working as a shepherd. Now imagine going from princedom to being a shepherd in the wilderness. And so he spends 40 years being a nobody, and then God absolutely banjaxes him at the burning bush, and God speaks to him out of this bush, and he says, Moses, I'm calling you to go rescue my people. And do you know, Moses, as impressive a leader as Moses is, do you know what he says to God? I can't go, I'm not impressive, I'm a bit rubbish, to be honest. And do you know what? God doesn't push back at any of that. He says, but I will be with you. And that is the important point, that God was with Moses. And so Moses then goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go. I will not let your people go. Let my people go. I will not let your people go. And there's a back and forth. And he cut a very long story short. There's this massive plague. After 10 plagues, there's this plague where all the firstborn of Egypt die. And Pharaoh says, and actually, before we get hung up on the fact, was that really bad that plague happened to Egypt? It was justice for the things that Pharaoh had done. Pharaoh had done horrendous things. And this was simply justice. And so Pharaoh says, fine, take them and go. So they go out into the wilderness. Pharaoh changes his mind and he chases them out in the wilderness. And people say, are we just going to die in the wilderness? And Moses says, you have only to remain silent. The Lord will fight for you. And then parting of the Red Sea. And this picture of the Exodus, is a picture that is so prominent in the Bible. It is so important because this picture of the Exodus actually describes what God is doing with all humanity, how he is rescuing all humanity from sin. And so we'll come back to that next week. We don't have time today, okay? And so, back to Moses. So they come out through the Red Sea. Pharaoh drowns in the Red Sea. Bad news. Moses goes up Mount Sinai, receives the law from God. I'm cutting out an awful lot of the story here, by the way, but we really don't have time. Moses receives the law from God, sees God almost face to face, and the law is basically helping God's people to understand how do they be God's people in a world that is broken and sin-soaked. What does it look like to live faithfully to God in this kind of world? And so they get to the edge of the Promised Land. Moses can't go into the Promised Land. That's the life story of Moses, and then somebody else takes them into the Promised Land. That's Joshua, by the way, and we're not going to talk about him. But the Exodus, can you see how this, like Moses is such a huge figure for them? And so if there's temptation to go back to anybody, there's going to be temptation to go back to Moses. Because things are not working out for them. They're suffering for following Jesus. And so you get why they're tempted to go back to this figure of familiarity and solidity. But let's see how Jesus measures up next to Moses. Consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house. Well, that's cool. Both of them are faithful so far. So our comparison is good. Now, a little definition here. You know when it says both faithful in all God's house? What are we talking about with God's house? In the Old Testament, we were talking about God's people, Israel, the community that belonged to God. Now, through Jesus, we are being grafted into that. And so we are part of God's house, this community of God's people across all kind of space and time. And so Moses was faithful in all God's house. But that's kind of where the comparison ends. Now starts the contrast. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses. If you think that Moses was a great leader, and you think that Moses was to be trusted, and you would have followed Moses, even though most of the people didn't actually follow Moses and they rebelled against him because that's the way the people go, Jesus is a better leader. Jesus is a greater leader. Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses. As much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now again, do you see, there's a little clue here about who Jesus is. If Jesus is the builder of the house and the builder of everything is God, Jesus therefore is God. We mustn't miss this point. Jesus is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. I think the best leaders of God's people recognize that they're not the end destination. They recognize that they are only ever signposts to the one who is greater. And Moses recognized that he was a signpost to the one who was greater. In fact, in Deuteronomy 18, Moses prophesied this. He said, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen." And do you know when this prophecy was seen to be fulfilled? It was when Jesus was sat with 5,000 men plus a bunch of women and children and probably lots of animals as well, and they were all going to starve, and then this little kid comes up with a bag with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus breaks it. They're all stuffed, and there's stacks of leftovers as well. And this is the point where the people realize that this is the one that Moses was talking about. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. This is him." Do you know, Moses knew he was a signpost. Both faithful. Moses faithful in all God's house. Jesus faithful to the Father. Moses was part of the house, but Jesus is the builder of the house. Moses was the servant. Jesus is the son. And if he's the son, then he's the heir. Jesus has been counted as worthy of more glory than Moses. As much more glory as the builder of the house has honor than the house itself. Jesus is worthy of more glory. He's the builder of it all. He's the one that we can trust. I love AI. I'm fairly confident that Jesus never looked like that at any point. But I just asked it, can you give me a little kind of advertisement for, if you were advertising Jesus as a construction firm, what would you do? And this was it. But he's the builder you can trust. And let's face it, builders that we've got some builders that work on the church, and we love them. Like, guys, if you're watching, we think you're amazing. And if you're not watching, then you should be, because you get in public praise here. We think they're great. And we wouldn't go anywhere else, because, good builders, they're not two a penny, are they? You've really got to search hard for them. And yet there is one builder, the builder of the house. He is the one that can be truly trusted. He is the one that we can place our confidence in. And so don't place your confidence in one who is part of the house. Place your confidence in the one who is building the house. Trust the builder. Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later, but Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. And we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Do you see there's an identity here that actually if we place our confidence and our hope in Jesus, then we have this identity as being part of his house, part of the community of his people across all time and space. But there is an if here. And that if is if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. And we're going to talk more about that next week, what it means to kind of hold fast to hope right to the very end. But I want to think just for a couple of minutes now about what is our hope. Our hope is everything that Tim talked about last week. It's everything that's in chapter 2, that Jesus was the one who was made a little lower than the angels. He was the one who gave his life in sacrifice for us. He was the one who was the high priest, who wasn't just the priest who offered the sacrifice, but he offered himself as the sacrifice in our place so that he would defeat sin and death. And do you know, we were chatting about this in Men's Youth Club yesterday morning. Like, this is just, it's such a wild thing, isn't it? That we've all sinned, and therefore we deserve death that comes with that. We recognize that. The wages of sin is death. And yet Jesus, because he died, not deserving that, it meant that he could absorb all the sin and all of the death into himself, which means that if we then accept his invitation to life, that we can live forever in him. We can know true life joined to him forever. That is our hope, and it's a hope that begins now, and it's a hope that carries on throughout eternity. And can I encourage you, like with some urgency, that if you've never come to the place of seeing Jesus as the only one that can be trusted, the only king who is worthy of giving your allegiance to, because he is the only one that has given himself in your place to demonstrate what the love of God looks like. He's inviting you to life. He is inviting you to life. And I don't say this because we want to build a brand for hope and we want to get more bums on seats in this place. Honestly, that is so far down the list. I want you to find life. I want you to find life in him. And so if you haven't, then come to him. And all you need to do is to come. You come, you draw near. Because the thing is, church, this is the thing, right? What is the hope? What is our hope, our confidence? Our hope and our confidence is that he has defeated sin and death. That is a forever thing. He didn't stay dead, but he is now alive. He is alive forevermore, and he is seated on the throne. He is in the place of all rule and government and power and authority. And he is returning to make all things new. Not only that, he has not left us as orphans, but he has come to us. He has come to us by his Spirit. He said, I want to live in you, I want to be with you, and I want to change you. I want to transform you to make you into the people that you were always created to be. That is our hope. And whatever happens in our lives, nothing can get near that hope. Nothing can change that hope. And so hold fast to him, because one thing I promise you is that he is holding fast to you. One thing I do think that this whole Moses thing raises, though, is that we as humans tend to have quite a complicated relationship with human leaders. And the way that we respond to leaders, the way that we kind of seek out leaders. And you could see for the Hebrews, the temptation to go back to Moses despite Jesus being greater. And I think human leadership can be both a gift and a curse. And for us, the tendency is to pedestal human leaders because we can see them. I've done it myself. The number of times I found somebody that I thought, they're great. They're like Leader Poppins. They're practically perfect in every way. There is nothing wrong with this person, and I'm gonna follow them everywhere they go, and I'm gonna be their kind of adoring little acolyte, and I'm going to absorb every word they say unquestioningly, only to discover that was not the case. This whole thing of pedestaling human leaders is fraught with danger. And for the Hebrews, there was a temptation to return to Moses, which was strong. Moses was a known quantity. There was a solidity about him, and yet the signpost couldn't save them. The servant couldn't save them. Only the Son could save them. Human leaders are given to the body of Christ as a gift to equip and to build up the church so that each one finds their place and makes their unique contribution in the body of Christ and to the story that God is telling. And human leaders are only to be followed in so much as they are following Christ. Paul said, didn't he? Follow me as I follow Christ. And that wasn't Paul being arrogant, saying, seeing as I'm practically like Jesus, just follow me. He was saying, in so much as you see me following Jesus, then follow me. In so much as you see the likeness, the character, the humility, the love of Jesus, follow. And I think I speak for Paul, Tim, and myself, and I probably speak for all of the home group leaders, life group, care group, cell group, small group, whatever you want to call yourselves, or even facilitators of the small groups and ministry leaders. I think I speak for all of you when I say that our desire is never to mistreat or mislead the people of God. Because the bottom line is that we recognize that this is a stewardship, and all y'all are not our people. You don't belong to us. You belong to him. And even with saying that, I recognize that there are times when, because we are still people in process ourselves, things will happen, unintentional things, sad things, where hurts will take place. And so I want to say on behalf of all of us, follow us as we follow Christ. And where we don't, please, for our sakes, point it out. And so consider Jesus, because he's the leader that you can trust. And I think it's also worth mentioning a sad reality at this point. Like, the reality is, that I've said this so often from the front. Like, we do recognize that you are not our people. You're his. And, in the same way as, like, when you're babysitting somebody else's kid, you don't throw them up quite as high as you would throw your own kid up, You take much better care of that child. And, because you know your own kid, don't you? Sorry. I did throw you up quite high, I always caught you, though. But the point is that, like, we do take care of what is not our own with much greater care. And we learn lessons when we fail from that. And on behalf of us, I would say that is always our heart. But the reality is that there are those in the body of Christ who, at the worst end, are self-serving, power-hungry people who feed off the power of God, the people of God, for their own purposes, instead of serving the purposes of God. People who we should look out for, not as wolves in sheep's clothing, but as shepherds in sheep's clothing, and wolves in shepherd's clothing. There we go. And I say this only because this is something that is such a prevalent issue for the church worldwide. And it's not something new. In Jeremiah, God says through Jeremiah, "Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture." And he says about the false prophets, "Their course is evil and their might is not right." These are leaders who were feeding off of God's people instead of feeding them. And you see, it's interesting, isn't it, that phrase, "their might is not right." What's one of the things that we are super drawn to? We're often drawn to the leaders that present this kind of loud, voluminous vision where they're like, "Come on, follow me." And actually what they're doing is they're saying, "Follow me." They follow my ambition here, follow my desire, follow my purposes, and it chews up and it spits out the people of God. And the thing is, like, we're drawn in because we love a show, don't we? We love the kind of rhetoric, and we love the kind of, oh, I feel like I'm part of something really big and really impressive here, and so I'm going to follow along with that, even though question marks are raised over the character of this person. And Paul experienced the same issue. He was having issues with the super apostles. Like, how do you get to become a super apostle anyway? Big S on your shirt, super sent one. But he was having issues with these super apostles who were saying that he was unskilled in speaking. Oh, Paul's rubbish to listen to. Don't listen to what he says. He's a bit rubbish. Listen to us because we're better speakers. Our rhetoric is better. We're more powerful and impressive people. So ignore Paul. And Paul's saying, yeah, but I know what I need to know. And the knowledge he's talking about here is the knowledge of Jesus. He's following Jesus. They're following their own ambitions. Church, we must not entrust ourselves to people based on rhetoric and impressiveness and powerfulness, but on a trajectory of proven character. And I don't say perfection, because if I stood up here and I said, follow leaders who are perfect, right, I'm off. I'll see you sometime in the future, maybe when Jesus returns, because I guess at that point we're talking perfection, aren't we? I'm talking about a trajectory of proven character where what happens in private is the same as what happens on the platform, where we are allowed behind closed doors and we see the truth of one another's lives. We see the reality of one another's lives, and we see the character. And do you know what the measure of it is? The measure of it is growing in love. That's the measure. And so ultimately, only follow us as we follow Jesus. Consider Jesus. And I'm pretty sure that there are some of you here this morning who have experienced authority being wielded over you in a way that has caused untold damage and hurt. And the temptation at that point is to turn away from Jesus, to say, well, it was your people that did this. Don't. Lean into him. Lean into him and listen to him, because he can be trusted. Do you know, even though we can't see him right now, he is real and he is at work. And do you know how I know he's real? I see evidence of it. Day in, day out, I see evidence of him at work in your lives, transforming you in your circumstances, maybe not transforming your circumstances, but changing you in them. And over the long haul, watching people over 5, 10, 15 years become people who are more loving, more self-controlled, more Jesus-like. I see him at work in you. I see his Spirit speaking. I hear his Spirit speaking, and I see the evidence of his Spirit at work in your lives. And so even though we can't see him right now, he is real and he is at work. Sorry. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the certainty of things not seen. And even though we might not be seeing it, he's at work. Even though you might not be seeing it in your circumstances right now, he is at work. And one day you will see the outcome. And you know, as Jesus said to Thomas, when Thomas wasn't there, when Jesus rose from the dead, and when he first appeared to his disciples, and Thomas said, I'm not going to believe, unless I can stick, and it's quite a sticky thing to say, isn't it, Unless I can stick my fingers in the holes and my hand in his side, I'm not going to believe. And then Jesus showed up and he said, crack on, Thomas. And Thomas fell at his feet. He said, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said to him, have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And for those of you that are clinging on right now, you can't see him, but you believe him. And you're holding on in the middle of your circumstances. Jesus says you are blessed. And then Peter, who was there and watched all of this, he said, though you have not seen him, you love him. He's writing to people who came to faith after Jesus had ascended. He said, though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. How beautiful is this? Why do we get to rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, even though we can't see him? It's because we know that we are obtaining the outcome of our faith, the salvation of our souls. One day, all of this will be made new. All of it. And so as we consider Jesus, as we see the only one who will eternally keep his promises, the good shepherd who will lead us safely home, the only leader who will never let us down, let's place our faith in him. Let's trust him. He is the only one that we can trust. Do you want to end that there, Jack?